So today's presenter is Stephen Jones. He is an arborist and caretaker of the Tropics and Amorphophallus collections, which is the collection that contains the corpse flower. In his work at the garden, Steve is interested in using the latest science and technology to understand plants more individually, both in cultivation and in nature, in order to maximize our ability to cultivate them. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I wish you could be here in person. Looking forward to the day when we're able to welcome you back. But in the meantime, I'm glad we're able to share this with you today in this format. And we're probably reaching some people who wouldn't otherwise be here anyways. So excited to talk about it.
Thank you so much. So to start us out, Steve, can you just tell us a little bit about this unusual looking plant that's appearing behind you on the image today?
Yeah, so this Amorphous Titanium is been working on blooming for a couple of weeks now. This particular individual plant was grown from a leaf cutting of a parent plant. So it was a little piece of the leaflet that was grown, and a number of years later, it's blooming for the first time. So the parent of this plant was one that we've had bloom 3 times previously. And if you were to refer to our website, 2013 and 2017, there's some good pictures looking back on that bloom. So a propagule of that.
Very cool. Thank you. So it's been exciting to follow the progress of this corpse flower, which is part of the collection that you maintain at the garden. Can you tell us a little bit about the U.S. Botanic Gardens corpse flower and Amorphophallus collection, and what are your goals for that collection as the caretaker?
Sure. So at the Botanic Garden, we have a collection of a good round number right now would be 150 individual plants. Most of those are seedlings at this point. We had 2 bloom last summer, and we were able to swap pollen with a few gardens, including Huntington Botanic Gardens and in California. And so we have over 100 seeds growing right now. And then the more mature plants, we have between 10 and 15 that are definitely bloom size. They're mature, and those are the ones that you'll see regularly. And then there's about 40 other individuals that came from our seeds in 2017. And those going on 4 years old now, I expect a couple of them might be ready to bloom within the next year or 2 at the earliest. We've seen some bloom at 4 or 5 years in cultivation.
So you're telling us we should really be expecting a lot more blooming corpse flowers in the upcoming years.
For sure. I mean, it strength in numbers for us. But yeah, part of I didn't answer the question fully, but part of our goals here, we do like to display these blooming. They do draw a lot of attention, and rightfully so. And it's just good to bring attention to plants at the Botanic Garden, and especially those like the titanium that is threatened with extinction in the wild in its native habitat in Sumatra. So that's one big goal, is to try and educate people on plants in general with this plant. And then as far as growing them and managing the collection, we're very committed to conservation of this particular species. We work with Chicago Botanic Garden and other gardens across the country in that effort. And so the reason we have so many is one, to show blooms as often as we can, and then to create diversity in cultivation. So when these plants bloom, we're able to create more and more unique individuals and work with other gardens to refine the collection that's in cultivation. So my goals are the garden's goals in that regard.
Awesome. So since we're looking at a not fully opened inflorescence here, I'm going to go ahead and share a picture from last year. Can you just tell us a little bit about what we're looking at here?
Yeah, so this was last late August into September. We had 2 plants bloom around the same time. So this is just me measuring the temperature of the spadix. The plant on the right was fully open. This was around midnight, and that spadix, the narrow spike, if you will, in the center of that plant heats up. It's thermogenic, and I believe I read 98 degrees Fahrenheit that night. Wow. It varies, and then you could see. It's very difficult to show in pictures how big these plants are, and you could see me standing next to that. My feet in that picture are somewhat close to where the base of that plant is, or where the stem would start.
Fascinating. And you also mentioned a little bit about this idea of conservation and species diversity. So we've got some great imagery. I'm going to share this, and I, again, just love for you to tell us what we're looking at here.
So this is our horticulture manager, Jim Adams, pollinating the second of the two blooms last summer. So this was the plant, the Huntington Botanic Garden in California had a plant bloom just a couple days ahead of this one, and they collected pollen and overnighted it our way. And here's Jim using that same pollen to pollinate our plant, and now we have, like I said, over 100 seedlings growing, and we did send some seeds out to other institutions, so they're growing from this same pollination event as well. So again, this is for each one of those flowers that you see within that space. They're on the spadix, that center column. Each one of those is an individual, unique individual. So the more we can do that, the more important the plants become.
And careful observers or listeners might have heard that you and I are sort of carefully referring to this whole thing behind you as a bloom or an inflorescence, but you did just mention flowers. So I'm going to share another image, and I'd love you to talk a little bit about the flowers involved in this plant.
Yeah, so this is, botanically, it's an unbranched inflorescence, and so being an aroid, it has a spathe and spadix within its floral structure, and on that spadix that grows in the center, you'll find these individual flowers. This picture shows the upper portion of those flowers, and most of the ones in that picture are male, and they are, in this image, are dehissing, and that's the pollen catching on tissue paper, which we came up with this way to collect the pollen. Once it dehisses, it just drops, so we have to find a way to funnel it into a tube and get it out to whoever needs it. And then the other flowers you see there, the kind of the longer reddish flowers, are female flowers that are past their receptive stage. Below this tissue paper would have been many hundred more female flowers. Those are receptive on the first night of opening, and then these male flowers are on the second night or the next morning, depending on the individual, but they open at separate times, and the result of that is that the plant typically cannot fertilize itself.
Got it. I'm going to stop sharing that image there and ask you another question, which is, so can you talk to us a little bit about the life cycle of this plant, and what are some of the signs you're looking for when you're trying to figure out if a plant is going to bloom?
Yeah, so just to get up to that point, from seed, there's been a lot of variation, especially in cultivation. They can bloom anywhere from 4 years old to, 10 or 15. And we've seen some variation just within our collection in that regard. But once they bloom for the first time, it's a bit unknown how often they should bloom, and in fact, how often they do. And there's been a lot of variation, again, in cultivation with that as well. And that's one of the more interesting areas for me. I've been asking a lot of questions about that myself, and it would be nice to be able to predict when they bloom. And for me, I have other references. We have a good sized collection of Amorphophallus species, and the other species bloom regularly, very predictably. And this one seems to be the oddball. So that raises a lot of questions for me. And so far in 3 years of growing the collection, I've seen a little bit more predictability than I anticipated in their life cycle. So give you an idea with this particular plant, about a year ago, its last leaf cycle finished. And that leaf cycle, when they're mature, can go up to a year in length sometimes. So with my experience, the cycle seems to be 2 years between growing a leaf, and then if the plant were to bloom, it'll bloom, set fruit, and the fruit will ripen all within a 2-year window. In some cases, it seems like it might stretch to 3, but 2 seems to be the more common number from what I'm seeing. And then with an individual plant, just trying to predict a bloom long before this stage, I'm learning a lot about that. With the number of plants we have, I get to see repeated cycles, and I've found some interesting results so far. There's a lot to learn in that regard. That's the bottom line. And one of the restrictions there is a lot of what we know about the plant is through cultivation. It's not through studying them in Sumatra in their native habitat. So that can actually guide you in the wrong direction sometimes if all your knowledge comes from cultivation. So I'm fascinated in that general area, and I think what I've learned so far is that they might be more predictable than we've thought, but how firm that is at this point is kind of an unknown.
Sure. So as we're thinking about cultivation, I know we've got a great series of pictures that are, what does it look like to sort of repot one of these gentle giants, if you will. So I'm going to go ahead and share that. And if you would be willing to just talk us through that, I think that'd be really great.
Sure. So in this picture, you're seeing a leaf that was cut down. When I grow these plants, I'm looking for the leaf showing first signs of the leaflets losing turgor pressure. When they stop taking up water, basically, or at least slow down. To me, that's the indicator that the plant is ready to move on to its next stage. And I've learned through experience that it might be better to remove these leaves before they senesce rather than wait a long period of time for that to play out. So this is just one plant that was quite a big one. It's probably 10 feet tall. And I cut it down, and that was step one.
So before we move on to the next picture, just a quick clarification. You're telling me this is one leaf that we are looking at. Looks like more than one leaf to me. Tell me more. Yeah,
so the leaf itself looks like a tree. But it is a leaf, and that's based on the anatomy of it. Just the botanical definition of a leaf, and you see the long petiole there that looks like a tree trunk. That's the petiole, and then this species will branch into 3 mid-veins, and then along the mid-veins you'll have the leaflets, and they all make up a single leaf together.
Wow. Okay.
And in this picture, you can see that is one corm on the cart there on the soil bag. They're very delicate and because they're very heavy. If you set that on a hard surface, it can actually crack under its own weight. So I put it on a bag of soil to protect it. And I guess with this picture, I was again trying to find some sort of size reference, but that particular corm was very big. It required 2 people to pick up. And even then, it was quite heavy. I didn't get to weigh this particular one, but it should be well over 100 pounds based on what it felt like when we picked it up. And we have had others at that weight as well. So I've got a little reference point there.
Yeah, and I think one thing I love about this picture is if you look over to the far right, you see another one of those petiole trunks where you can't even see the rest of the leaf because it's huge and it's out of the picture. So it's fun to be able to see that
Right.
scale.
And this is that same corm, just a little closer up. You can see that there are still roots on the corm itself. That's a little bit of a result of me cutting down the leaf when I do. And yeah, just the size reference. That is all one bit of stem tissue. That's where all the sugars that the leaf produces are stored. And this is the only part of the plant that will support a bloom of the size behind me. That bloom will use almost exclusively the resources in that corm. I've seen a little bit of uptake of water in the pots, but generally the pot doesn't need to be watered, and it seems to be that everything is reliant on this part of the plant, the stem. And just a look at the underside of that corm, you can see that piece on the bottom is what remains of the previous state of the corm. Those resources were used to produce the leaf, and then that leaf in turn produced a bigger corm behind that. And just collecting data. You can see this one's right around 21.5 inches in diameter across the corm. Give you a little size reference, almost 2 feet across, and I've got some that are 2 feet across. And here's a plant in the pot. At this point, I would top it off with soil. I plant them nice and loose. Oxygen's just as important as water, so don't want to overcompact that media around the plant, especially with titanum. They are susceptible to rot when they are in between cycles. And this pot itself is, for me, I prefer a little bigger pot, but at some point, the pots start to get out of control. So I am experimenting with a 200-gallon pot with one plant right now, and it's kind of mind-blowing when you walk up to it. But this is good enough. Usually you try and go 2 to 3 times the diameter. This is less than that, but it works. You just have to stay on top of the watering and nutrients. And this image is one of my favorites. I spoke a little bit about cutting down the leaf, early, if you will, when it's still green and just when it begins to take up less water. With all the mature titanums, when I do that and give that petiole, cut it down to a foot in height or so, and I'll give it a couple of weeks to begin to rot away. And then I'll repot all the pictures you just saw. I'll clean off the corm. And inside the base of that petiole, I'll always find these buds. And that's an area of interest for me right now because, it's only been 3 years now, but I'm trying to compare what the plant looks like in this stage and what information you might be able to derive from the buds in this state. I've seen plants go too far where we leave the leaf intact, we let it senesce, turn yellow, collapse, rot away, and that can take weeks and weeks and weeks. And then when you go to clean off the corm, I've seen this bud before, but rotted, completely rotten. And so that's what kind of led me to cutting it down earlier. And I've yet to see one that was rotten. They seem to be in really good shape going that route. And I've got a number of them that look similar to this. And I can't say for certain, but what I think you're looking at there mostly is those smaller buds would likely be leaf buds. And then the one in the center, I've had now 3 look like this after cutting the leaf out, and that center bud turns out to be a bloom later on. And in the 2 cases last summer, that happened within a month of me repotting. In this case, this year, this plant actually took about a year for that bud to develop to the point it's at now. But same scenario, I cut down the leaf and saw this, and later on it was blooming. So yeah, this picture has a lot of information in it for me, but there's a lot to learn still.
Well, thank you so much for sort of orienting us to the process of growing. And I think we've got some amazing questions in the chat that will really help us talk more about some of the ways we grow this plant. So I'm going to maximize your image here. So talking about growing this one from seeds, from cuttings, how many cuttings did you try or seeds did you try before one grew? How easy is it to grow this plant?
Yeah, so this particular plant was grown from a cutting prior to when I worked here. I've been here about 4 years. This one was grown before that, but there are some great resources out there for growing titanum from a cutting, and it's a good way to share a plant without affecting its wild habitat. The cuttings themselves, you can take a small piece of the leaflet, and it's as simple as putting hormone on it and sticking it in perlite and waiting. They actually grow pretty easily that way. I know we have here at the Botanic Garden found that some individuals will root more readily than others. There's one that I know we tried to grow from a cutting repeatedly, and it didn't work. Whereas this particular plant, the parent plant, seems to be very easy to root from cutting. So I can't explain that, but for the ones that will allow themselves to be propagated that way, the process is that simple. Just a piece of the leaflet, growth hormone, and in perlite.
Great. So we looked at some pictures of this, and you mentioned the corm. Is the corm like a tulip bulb? Like, tell us a little bit more about what the corm is doing.
Yeah, the corm itself is again, it's all starchy tissue. It's really similar to a potato, which is a tuber. But this corm, this species, has a tendency to grow from a single growth point. And then it also has a tendency to replace. You saw that the bottom of the corm was kind of rotted away, or used up, if you will, and it'll produce a new corm. Whereas a tuber will kind of grow in different directions and grow multiple plants. There's a little bit of conversation about that in the botanical world, which is more appropriate. But yeah, this species tends to grow from a single growth point, but what I've observed with our collection is that seems to be more accurate for when they're mature, not necessarily when they're young. We still have a number of seedlings from 2017 that are to this day producing a number of leaves at once from a single corm, and in some cases they're 6-8 feet tall. And then we have another scenario where a mature plant, the apical meristem, that central bud died, and as a result, the corm produced leaves all around the top of the stem tissue. So now that mature plant even has a number of individual leaves. So again, an area where I think there's a little more to learn. And if you were to look a little bit, I know Kansas State right now has a titanum getting ready to bloom, and it has 2 or 3 leaves on it, and it also has 2 or 3 blooms on it all at once. So that's fascinating to me. It doesn't follow the normal pattern we see, and just another indicator that there's a lot more to learn.
Great. So you touched on this a little bit, but can you tell us about why you cut off the petiole prior to the yellowing and dying, especially because it seems like you'd want as many nutrients as possible to go back into the corm?
Yes, it was through experience mostly, and then after experience, you apply some plant science, I guess. But yes, so not knowing anything about the plants when I started growing them, the normal thing to do is to let that leaf senesce, like you said, use up all those sugars it produced. Let those sugars return to the corm, and then basically just don't interrupt the plant and hope it blooms. And I didn't know any better until I saw one of our, at the time it was our largest plant. I went through that whole process, and I want to say that senescence period from the first signs of that loss of turgor all the way to finally the petioles rotten and we could pull it off. There was months. And when we did that, there was a bud inside of the petiole about 6 inches tall, and it was rotten. So that my antennas went up after that. And then the following year, we had another plant, which actually the parent plant of this one, it had bloomed in 2017, and it produced an enormous leaf after that, 2018. And then in 2019, I noticed the leaflets lost their turgor, and I didn't wait this time. I cut the top of the leaf off. I was a little in between, so I left the petiole on for a while, but then even that, I was like, well, I've got to get that off of there. Because I suspected that if you've grown these plants, that petiole is very thick, 10, 12 inches across, and it's very heavy. So you can imagine a bud trying to make its way up through the center of that. It's a lot to overcome, especially in cultivation when you don't have that, you don't have the wind and rain and microbes and animals and all sorts of other ways that process could be sped up. So long story short, I cut that one down, and I cut slices in the petiole to try and create more surface area for it to rot quicker. And the next day, inside that petiole, a bud popped up 4 inches overnight, as if it was being held back from being able to develop. And that turned out to be a bloom very soon after. It developed very rapidly. And as it developed, I noticed all kinds of signs that, there were warps in the bud, and the bracts around the inflorescence was wrinkled, and overall the bloom turned out to be kind of small for the species, and just all sorts of signs that bud didn't quite get to live out its full potential. And so hopefully all that makes sense, and that's why I cut them down early now. I don't think there's two things. I think there's a possibility that in cultivation we can prevent them from blooming through our normal practices, and two, if that's the case, I don't think you have much to gain by allowing those extra sugars to return from the leaf into the corm. I don't think there's a good enough benefit to that, and I've seen zero signs whatsoever that cutting down the leaf early impacts the next cycle in any negative way. I haven't had any issues with rot, and in fact, I usually see a bud right there in the petiole, and as soon as the obstacle, if you will, is removed, those buds typically start to grow immediately. So I hope that wasn't too detailed.
Now, I think there's a lot of great information there. And you are mentioning that the leaf senesces, and so then the plant is going into its dormant phase. We have somebody in our audience who acquired a corpse flower during its vegetative phase. Now it's going dormant. How do you care for the corm during dormancy?
So that question bothers me a little bit. Just it doesn't register in my head. I don't personally think dormancy is a proper term for this species. Some Amorphophallus species don't actually really go dormant, and from everything I've observed, I've not observed one of these plants stop growing completely. Like I said, when I'm in between stages, I usually see the plant start to develop very soon after. Even if it's minuscule progress, it's continuing to grow the entire time. That's what I've observed. So that, for me, that's important to answer the rest of your question. I get them repotted immediately as soon as the plant has moved on from the stage it's in. So for me, that's if you had a leaf that petiole has rotted sufficiently that you could pull it off, and by that point the plant's not relying on that whatsoever. Maybe you'll have some roots left over, but that's okay. Being a monocot, it'll discard those and produce new roots. And so I repot them right away. I get them cleaned up every cycle. I wash them right off so there's no soil on them, and get them in fresh media. And I water them in right away. Like I said, keeping the media nice and loose. And you want that corm to be hydrated consistently. And as long as that's the case, and as long as there's ample warmth, that cycle will continue from everything I've seen in my experience. So there's no storage period, in my opinion, unless you're really limited on your resources. If you need to bring it inside and you can't grow it inside and you have to get through the winter, you could store it. But I still think you keep it moist at that point and give it some chance of growing, because otherwise you're going to interrupt its next cycle. And that's where I think you'll run into the potential for rot if the plants just stop growing altogether.
Interesting. And so this leads well into another question, which is that if the corm's stored energy is almost all used up during the bloom, where is it getting the energy for its next leaf?
Yeah, so, well, the leaf itself is meant to be production, right, for the plant. So all the leaf really needs is a little bit of stem material to get going, and it'll do the rest. It'll help. It'll start to photosynthesize. It'll produce sugars for the corm, and the corm will store some of those sugars, and it'll use some of the sugars to produce roots. So the leaf is what helps you establish the corm in the first place. So you basically just need to get it started, and the leaf needs, or it's better if the leaf has a lot of stem tissue to rely on, but it doesn't need it. You could take. Not recommending this with your plant, but you could take a little piece of that corm and easily grow a new plant from it. It might be small, but and then so I've only seen a few bloom myself, but they lose a lot of density in the corm, a lot of weight, a lot of those sugars get used up, but they don't use it all up to nothing. There's usually something left over.
So speaking of, what the plant relies on to grow, are there any special nutritional requirements that you're on the lookout for corpse flowers?
Yeah, I'm a bad person to ask that question. I don't with most plants, and especially these, I don't get too involved with real special recipes of soil, the nutrients. I found that these are pretty average in their needs. They need water and oxygen around the roots, and they need the 16 essential nutrients that all plants need. So a well-balanced fertilizer works. That's all I use. I've experimented a bit with adding some extra potassium, just to help uptake and maybe aid in building strength. But I've not seen any need to really experiment too much in that regard. I'm sure there are others that grow the plant and they have strong feelings one way or another, and that's great. I haven't done too much with it myself.
Totally fair. So we've talked a little bit about plants grown from seeds, from leaf cuttings, and you just mentioned a corm cutting. Can you talk about sort of the role of clones and clonal reproduction versus non-clone reproduction within the Amorphophallus community? I guess at the USBG, and you're also talking about broader as we talk about collaboration with other botanic gardens. So like, what's going on with that?
Well, there's a few things. If you're looking to aid in the conservation effort, it's really important to have unique individuals. But if you're just trying to share the plant with another institution, a clone works just fine, and you might even be able to give the clone some attributes. Say the inflorescence spathe typically has this color, the spadix looks like this. It bloomed at this age, and maybe that works for the grower's needs, and a clone is a good idea at that point. But then, with all plants, when they're in cultivation, sometimes you see characteristics that are really special or useful. Maybe a particular plant seems to bloom really young and often, and so you want to be able to show it to the public. So maybe that's an individual you clone. But and then the final, there is a benefit to cloning individuals for conservation as well. It's a great way to share the plant with others without taking from nature where they're threatened right now. So there's a couple benefits to cloning, and like I said, it's actually relatively easy with this plant.
Okay, so I think I was going to say we have time for one more question, but we're going to do two more because I love this question. Can I grow any Amorphophallus species at home or in my own garden? And for in my own garden, let's be thinking of the greater DMV region. I know we may have folks joining us from farther afield, but can't expect Steve to answer for every environment around the world.
So that's a common question. The answer is excitedly yes. You can grow a species called Amorphophallus konjac, and you can grow it outside in this area and a lot of the United States, actually. You could plant it right in the ground and leave it, or you can grow it inside as well. That is a particularly stinky plant. I think the biggest I've seen are maybe my height, like 5-6 feet, but they're typically more like 3 or 4 feet. Very fishy, stinky smell to that one. So that's a common one that's grown outside. Amorphophallus canifolius is also grown outside, maybe a little warmer range than the konjac. But in this area, I know people have successfully grown that outside. And then indoors, there's all kinds of species that you can grow indoors, especially species that come from savanna environments do really well indoors because in the winter you can just store them and then you grow them in the summer. There's a number of smaller, quote unquote, miniature Amorphophallus species that are fun. Just look around and just with what I said before, just be responsible about where the source and try not to acquire plants that are from the wild.
Okay, so now it really will be time to ask our last question, and we're going to ask it first to the audience, and then we're going to get an answer from Steve, and we're going to do this through our polls tab. So our question is, make your prediction. How tall do you think this bloom will be, this inflorescence will grow? We're going to give you the hint that the last one that bloomed at the US Botanic Garden grew to be 107 inches tall. So what are you thinking for this one? It is time to vote. And Steve, perhaps while they're voting, you could tell us a little bit about some of the benchmark markings you put on the measuring stick there.
Yeah, sure. So you can see behind me a few of the marks. And then if you were to look at our live stream on our YouTube account, you can see the extent of those. All those pink markings are daily measurements that we take, and it's just a great visual to see the progress of the plant. And they do tend to have a bit of a spurt in the middle of a 2-week cycle, if you will, and towards the end they slow down. So it's actually an indicator of when they're getting close to blooming. And then you can't see it here, but if you're on the live stream, you'll see 2 yellow marks above that. The lowest yellow mark is that 107 inches that Elizabeth just mentioned. That's a record internally at the US Botanic Garden. The mark above that is a record that was set up in New Hampshire and recognized by Guinness as the world record for an unbranched inflorescence and obviously a titanum. And that was 122 inches and 122 and a quarter inches. So
wow,
big.
All right. So before I reveal our audience prediction, Steve, I'd love to get your perspective. Where are you placing your bets for this one?
My bets are it will bloom this weekend, and it's just about wrapped up on gaining height. Depending on how many days that is, it could grow an inch, maybe 2 a night over the next couple nights. But I think it's pretty maxed out. I'm hoping to get over 100, and we're right there. Maybe tomorrow morning. So if you want a specific number, I will say 101.5 for this.
Ooh, so precise. Well, I will tell you that our viewing or listening audience today is more optimistic than you. The 30% or 40% of our audience thinks this is going to be between 111 and 115 inches. So they've got a lot of faith in this little corpse flower that could behind you there.
I would love for that to happen. I'll root for you guys. I don't think it'll get there for this one, but hopefully we do get one in that range, because then we'll be dancing around that world record.
Yeah. Well, as Steve said, we've got the markings on the measuring stick, so you can follow along on the live stream through our YouTube. And I'm going to ask our fabulous assistants if you can drop the link to where they'll be able to find our live stream in the chat. That would be amazing, so that people can follow along and see what this looks like when it blooms. So with that, we have really reached the end of today's program.